We live in a culture that more often rejects feelings of despair, anxiety, and hopelessness as opposed to openly examining the darker aspects of existence in a more relaxed light. Imagine a doctor telling her patient that he is sick with a chronic illness. The patient insists that he feels fine, and hasn't yet noticed any obvious symptoms of the sickness. The patient decides that since he feels fine, he must be okay, and walked out of the doctor's office, ignoring the doctor's diagnosis and the possibility of him being cured from this sickness. It was like those first discomforts of a sick man, to which he pays but little attention till they run into one continuous suffering, and then he realizes that what he took for a passing disorder means the most momentous thing in the world for him, means his death. This is how many of us get through life. Not conscious of changing conditions to notice any deeper, underlying issues. Sometimes, we even willfully ignore arising discomforts and signs of disease, a deep sense of existential turbulence that seemingly gets stirred up by a bad day. Or a lingering feeling of emptiness as the world zips past. Ignoring those feelings each time they arise by being increasingly invested in the temporal world, its systems and roles, a world that we escape behind an undisputable disguise called normality. That one is in despair is not a rarity. No, it is rare, very rare, that one is not in despair. Rather than succumbing to ignorance, some of us rebel, rejecting all conformity and normality, but in the process still not being able to secure a deeper sense of freedom. Unrest, disharmony, and anxieties are fundamental parts of the human experience. So, why are we so eager to brush these facts aside? Have we been lying to ourselves and thus need to evade topics of suffering as we are being confronted repeatedly? Are we afraid to uncover the causes and reasons behind such calamity? The despairing man who is unconscious of being in despair is, in comparison with him who is conscious of it, merely a negative step further from the truth and from salvation. Anyone who really knows mankind might say that there is not one single living human being who does not despair a little, who does not secretly harbor an unrest, an inner strife, a disharmony, an anxiety about an unknown something or a something he dare not even try to know, an anxiety about some possibility in existence or an anxiety about himself. According to Kierkegaard, a 19th-century Christian philosopher and the father of existentialism, since the outer world is subject to imperfections, to avoid despair is to ignore our spiritual nature. Instead of investigating the sources and reasons behind despair, we evade the topic of existential suffering altogether and let ourselves be consumed by the materialistic world through seeking temporary sources of pleasure, daydreaming, and a denial of God. Or in other words, a denial of the divine and spiritual. Regarding despair as a work of art up for intuitive interpretation, Kierkegaard was not afraid to confront his fears and sense of shame of having experienced despair. According to Kierkegaard, the opposite of despair is avoidance and cowardice. Sweeping despair under the rug is considered a type of philosophical and spiritual suicide. On the other hand, despair, also according to Kierkegaard, reflects a formative misstep of an individual's sense of self. In other words, despair happens when one is not willing to be the self which one truly is, or not wanting to become anything that one is. The development of our selfhood depends on one's capacity to grow while confronting one's anxieties and despair. A human being is a synthesis of the infinite and the finite, of the temporal and the eternal, of freedom and necessity. In short, a synthesis. A synthesis is a relation between two. Kierkegaard understood the human self in two parts, the physical and the mental. Despair is caused by the misalignment within the self, an imbalance between what Kierkegaard called the infinite and the finite. The infinite, described by Kierkegaard, is an abstract and fanciful aspect of the self that gives one the power of imagination. It is of the eternal and free form. The finitude, on the contrary, is of the temporal and bounding, social and materialistic in nature. Even though Kierkegaard recognized despair as suffering, he also regards despair as the highest psychological state that one must reach before truly embarking on one's spiritual journey. In his book Sickness Unto Death, he suggested that one must become aware of this sickness and then to be cured, by uniting the finite and the infinite, the two aspects of one's self. A deeper sense of joy can be a product of experiencing and understanding deep suffering. According to Kierkegaard, to be unaware of one's existential suffering is itself a form of inauthentic suffering. To be conscious of the despair but wish to lose this painful awareness by burying ourselves in the finite, or exterior world, is another tier of suffering. To revolt against despair by raging against everything in life is counter-spiritual and is yet another form of suffering. Suffering is a key element in an individual's growth. Our reaction to external stimuli and its inevitable unpleasantries can be liberated if we learn how to make use of this suffering. It is possible to transform oneself and the subject of suffering by welcoming the process of self-development and growth. Lessons in life are often best realized through failure and disappointments. Suffering is both unavoidable and can be served as a pathway to actualize our potential. Kierkegaard believed that the spiritual individual understands suffering as the essential expression of the relationship to the Absolute. The spiritual individual is then one who understands the necessity of suffering and is ready to face all of life's challenges by cultivating a positive attitude to suffering. Despair reveals the freedom of our true nature, while suffering serves as the motivator to seek beyond the finite world in order to bridge into the infinite. Therefore, we can employ despair as a means to explore our innate freedom and at the same time, utilize suffering as a tool to the liberation of despair. Suffering is inescapable and thus is a key factor in the process of self-development and transformation. We should courageously face suffering by being actively and harmoniously involved throughout the course of our lives. How strange that the most coveted good in the world is independence, yet almost no one covets the only way that truly leads to it, suffering. In the book Sickness Unto Death, Kierkegaard describes the sickness that arises from not embracing one's self, or one's potential. Despair, according to Kierkegaard, is the sickness unto death, a developmental failure of the self. We are in despair when we are not moving in the direction of the person we could potentially be, which is the best version of ourselves. Despair, viewed in this way, is simply a consequence of, quote Kierkegaard, not willing to be the self which one truly is. The negative feeling that comes with despair is simply a feeling of dizziness of facing our innate freedom, to become or not to become. For Kierkegaard, despair is sin, and sin is what prevents one from uniting with God. Sin is either ignorance, a form of intensified weakness, or defiance. It is being ignorant of oneself and its potentials, continuing the pattern of a less than ideal life, or to rebel against divine possibilities and the good that has been bestowed upon humanity. Since God the Absolute is the ultimate source of all things good, life, love, joy, etc., the less connected we are to God, the more despair we are in. We lose ourselves when we do not align ourselves by becoming transparent in front of God by laying out all the sins before Him, or by becoming more authentic. Kierkegaard wanted to awaken Christians of his time to strive for an unconditional and continual spiritual commitment. Since there is no end to this sickness unto death until we die, the Christian philosopher implies that our spiritual path is always a work in progress. The realization of despair can be a catalyst to profound change. One of the world's oldest religions, Buddhism, has its roots in the Buddha's contemplations upon the human condition and its suffering, or dukkha. Buddhism teaches that suffering is inherent in samsara, the cycle of existence. Dukkha is a Sanskrit word and is commonly translated as non-satisfaction, suffering, unhappiness, despair, or stress, and appears in the first tier of the Four Noble Truths in Buddhism. The Four Noble Truths are generally regarded as the first framework of teachings that were taught by the Buddha. It laid out a progression of the understanding of dukkha and offers a path of release from such suffering. The first noble truth, life is suffering. Similar to Kierkegaard's view, the realm of samsara, or the temporal world, is subject to imperfections and disappointments. One must be aware of this inescapable truth before proceeding on to examining the reasons of our suffering. The second noble truth, attachment causes suffering. Money, sex, drugs, power, romantic love, material goods. We often crave and cling to shallow pleasures that are short-lived and impossible to fully satiate. Our continuous cravings for temporal pleasures cause a lingering sense of dissatisfaction and incompleteness. Our refusal to see the impermanence of all things and notions often leads us to cling to mistaken ideas. We assume and behave as if everything is immutable. Dukkha, or suffering, according to the Buddha, is caused by clinging due to our ignorance, aversion, and a fundamental ignorance of the nature of reality. Just as Kierkegaard understood that despair and suffering are inescapable, the Buddha recognized that life is inherently unsatisfactory. One may be able to temporarily relieve suffering by fulfilling one's desire and craving, but suffering itself can never be avoided. In the third noble truth, the Buddha pointed out that our suffering is created by selfish cravings, personal desires, ignorance, and the misconception of our existential condition. In order to become free from suffering, one must recognize suffering in the first place and detach our grasping of misconceptions through deep insights into the nature of reality. In the fourth noble truth, the Buddha offered the Eightfold Path as systematic methods to free one from suffering. According to the Eightfold Path, an individual can attain nirvana, a release from suffering, through the practice of virtues, meditation, the cultivation of wisdom, awareness, and so on. All 8 Buddhist paths of development and ultimate liberation are interconnected and should be developed simultaneously according to the individual's capacity for realization. If the selflessness of phenomena is analyzed and if this analysis is cultivated, it causes the effect of attaining nirvana. Through no other cause does one come to peace. Anxiety and despair are the dizziness of freedom, too often viewed in a negative light and hence suppressed, blinding us from seeing the positive effects they can have on spiritual growth, possibility, and freedom. Despair, anxiety, and hopelessness signal us to seek understanding, healing, and make changes in our lives. To become more transparent, to become more authentic, and to live to our potential. Treating suffering and despair as a chance for a re-evaluation of our values, meaning, wants, and purpose can help us lead a life full of love and integrity. Our greatest potential is our capability for compassion, loving-kindness, and joy. If you look for truth, you may find comfort in the end. If you look for comfort, you will not get either comfort or truth, only soft soap and wishful thinking to begin, and in the end, despair.